Okay, welcome to a discussion, Youth Long-Term Player Development. My name is Chris Prue. I am the Director of Education for DigitSoul. We develop technology, AI, and ML platforms for movement assessment. So that's my main gig. I'm also a practicing clinician and coach. So my background is my master's and PhD ABD are in exercise science with emphasis on performance-based outcome measures. I have a DC as well, so I'm a doctor of chiropractic, former of athletic training for about 15 years. I've been a certified strength conditioning specialist for 27 years. And through that time, a lot of my practice in working with athletes from the performance perspective anyway, has been dealt in the youth population. So I've been doing this a long time, and I'll be filtering in a lot of my information in here. A lot of my pictures and experiences are actually from my own programs. Actually, I'm wearing some of my swag right here, right now, with Blackbird Strength Conditioning that we developed many years ago at one of the high schools close to where I was working. So let's get right into it. So the purpose of this discussion, we're looking at long-term player development. This is what's called a high level, so we're not getting into a lot of the specific details or the weeds of things, and is really just to sort of bring some of the concepts to light. If this is something that's new to you, then it'll give you a bit of a framework to identify some of the areas that you may want to work on putting together. Emphasis on sort of the resistance training aspect of things, monitoring, and then I have some key elements at the end that I want to bring about. But again, keep in mind this is a high level overview of what's going on with regards to long-term player development, again, with sort of that emphasis on the youth population. Similar, as we would see in the older population, the adult population, but there are some characteristics that we find in the youth to be a little bit different than how we may want to operate with an older population. So we're going to look at the basis of long-term development, and there are 10 pillars that are part of the National Strength Conditioning Association's outline on their position regarding long-term development. Sort of a brief discussion on the history of long-term development, maybe where it came from, some of the things that we may want to take into consideration. Looking at adaptation to training. Most of this is emphasis on resistance or anaerobic, which does cross over into the neuromuscular aspect of the stretch shortening cycle. And then injury characteristics. In youth, emphasis on physical activity related. Programming and monitoring, again, sort of that high level of maybe what's available to us today, and then a bit of a conclusion. So you can see this is a video of one of our programs with some of the youth populations. When I would take in student interns, they would always say, wow, this is a little different than maybe what we learn in school. And I always say, well, there's utopia, right? There's the way that there's perfection, and then there's sometimes the business aspect of things. In other words, if you could see in there really clearly, we've got 3 squat racks, but at any given moment in time, we may have 50 athletes. And so if they're all on a push day, it could be a little bit challenging to have everyone squat first. So we need to make sure that we have some efficiencies with regards to how we apply some of the things that we're doing. And as a lot of people identify in practice, many of us consider ourselves as using evidence-based practice, and then also we have the practice-based evidence, right, which is sometimes how things actually work in coordination with what we know from the literature. How long is long-term development? So you can see this little graphic is just a representation of sort of when it might begin and where it may end, if in fact it ever ends. So I want to turn around and pose this to you. Is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? Is it 4 years or is it forever, right? And I used to have a saying when I worked with some of my students was, you know, if you're running a program, and I did a lot of, seasonal programs, for example, we did a summer program where that video came from, and, was I really, part of the long-term development? Well, I was part of it. I wasn't doing the whole thing, but let's take a reality check. And, if you're doing something for 6 months, what kind of coach are you? Is it more corrective? What sorts of things are going on? How long do you actually need to have someone, to make a difference? And I will say that if they're having some issues, then maybe those corrective changes do not require a whole lot of time. But in general, for you to say that you really made a huge difference on that athletic profile of that particular individual or a team, you probably had to have them for a long time. So I also like to interject and use my kids a lot. So this is my son Logan. He's almost 9 now. So he was just over 2 years old at this, and so our kids would love to be part of, some of the things that we were doing. That's not a weighted barbell, but if it was, that's okay. And so you are limited to what you're able to accomplish. And so part of it, what we see with some of the children is, the modeling behavior, which is an important aspect of being that coach or the parent or whatever in being involved in this long-term development. So it really is forever. It starts when they're really, really young, right? And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit here about, the difference between athletic performance training and sport performance training, right? So there is a little bit of difference between those two. Some will argue there's a lot of difference. There's some overlap, and they'll go in one direction versus the other. But when we look at long-term athletic development, that's why we don't call it sport, we call it athletic development, because we're really trying to come at it from this holistic approach. It's not hyper-focused on, really one specific outcome or one specific event or sport. It's focused on what is characterized as being an athlete. What are the components involved in athletic performance of an individual? So if you've read anything in youth athletic development, I'm sure you've come across Lloyd and their group. They work in a really unique sort of environment that encompasses a lot of high-end coaching and research, and so they've done a lot of work in this particular area. And this is another screenshot of some of the groups of kids. These are actually high school kids, so they're a little bit older, but they range from incoming freshmen up into actually we had some returning freshmen from college as well. And I'm going to read this. Youth of all ages and abilities are provided with a strategic plan for the development of their health and physical fitness. It's also important to maximize physical activity participation rates, reduce the risk of sport activity-related injury, and to ensure long-term health and well-being. And I think what's interesting when you really sort of evaluate that quote is there was a lot of emphasis on physical activity, health, and well-being, which is really at the base of athletic development. Right. I was presenting at a conference, and another gentleman that you may be familiar with if you've read anything in this youth aspect is Dr. Avery Feigenbaum. And as we were having a discussion before both of our presentations, he said, man, and this was at least 15 years ago, he said, man, I think we need to start implementing a preseason, right, to get kids up to the level at which we really start to do preseason training with them, because the essence of preseason training is to prepare, for the upcoming sports season. And a lot of kids were showing up, early, especially in the fall, right, because they've had the summer off, they went home, and some of these kids weren't necessarily doing something. And I'll interject a little bit more in there, but we often find that not only in just the really young athletes, but even in the older athletes too, that may have some off-season time where they're not actually in the face of, their conditioning coaches and their sport coaches. So these are the 10 pillars. So this is part of the long-term athletic development statement by the National Strength Conditioning Association. And I'm not going to read these verbatim, but long-term athletic development, it should accommodate for being very individual, right? Because especially at that youth level, there is a lot of variability with regards to the growth and development or the maturation. There are some standards. The standards that we kind of equalize is PHV, you may have seen written, and that's peak height velocity, or their growth rate, because we've got some data that shows that that has a very high relation to their puberty level. So it gives us a better biological basis of where they are as far as maturation goes. All different ages, we really should be doing a bunch of different things that incorporate both the physical as well as the psychosocial, right? Because we don't want them to burn out too soon. We don't want them to experience really high level of play too soon. All youth should be encouraged to enhance their physical fitness from early childhood with a primary focus on motor skill and muscular strength development. And you'll see at my conclusion, so I have a video in there, and it came from a presentation I was doing on motor development in youth sport. And it's my daughter, I've got a 3.5-year-old running T-drills and ladders and things like that. Not necessarily known to be the most fun thing for kids, but we've had this discussion in various departments I've worked in as a professor and researcher, where, should we really have organized fitness programs? And many of us would say, well, no, I mean, we really just want kids to play. But the problem is it available to them? Is it promoted, within the communities and by families and things like that, especially as technology has improved dramatically in gaming and sport specialization, where kids aren't doing as much as they used to in terms of actual play and development, and really just getting stronger and improving motor skill development just by being physically active. And we're seeing a lot of change in that. And that's been problematic from the health aspect. We do want kids to do different things, so we call it sampling, right? So I told you my son was 8, so we've had him in just the last 12 months. So he started downhill skiing this year, in organized tennis, organized soccer, organized baseball, which I'm a coach of, organized flag football, organized basketball, and then of course there's all the other play aspects. So we try and get our children involved in many different things. One, to see if they're going to like it or not, but two, really to develop some of those positional characteristics that, when he's playing baseball, that's very different than when he's playing soccer or playing football, right? So even though, football may seem to mimic what some people are doing in soccer, well, people are chasing you and they're trying to tackle you, which is different than simply just taking the ball away, which is different than getting into a batter's box and being the center of attention and then hitting a ball, and the only people that are at play, are involved when there's runners and so on. So it really has a different physical as well as mental, aspect of it. And again, you'll see here the health and well-being, very, very important, because that's at the essence. And I'll tell another little story in a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen as a result of some of our programming in the youth population to enhance that component. It does a few things for us, one of which is give us the baseline for how an athlete is supposed to be able to function in that multi-sport environment, but also just the overall health aspect. Conditioning that helps to reduce the risk of injury. And one would think that that should be the no-brainer, and that's sort of the intent, and it really is the intent. But as we've seen this become a lot more popular and as a profit center, right? People make money at training young athletes, then there can be some problematic characteristics with regards to the implementation of some of these things, more trends, more products, more things that may not have a science or evidence-based component to it. In the development, if you are involved in specific athletic development, that we know that we should be utilizing multiple training modes. And what we'll talk about in a little bit here is that there is a lot of overlap. So in other words, if there's multiple things that have the same outcome, there's no reason that we shouldn't be changing them up, and probably even more benefit from doing so. Monitoring and assessment. That's a big part of where we're at today, partly because we know that it helps to inform us, and it's easier than ever with today's technology to be able to collect that sort of information. Related to that, looking at the progress and making sure that we're implementing the appropriate training programs at the appropriate intensities, at the appropriate levels for the appropriate development of athletic profiles that we know are part of sport in general. And then quality. The quality not of the programming per se, but the quality of people like us, the people that are partly involved in the intervention process, and making sure that we're using some consistency across the board in terms of the developmental programs that again are typically evidence-based, that have some consistency within what we know to be true in the field, and then that's going to be actually better for that progression, right? So if I'm focusing on working with a specific age group, when they move up to the next level, then we know that we've gotten that. We know that they've built those fundamentals as they go up to the next level, either in the athletic development or in what we see as requirements in specific sports. So the history, and I love looking backwards at some of these things to sort of look at, what direction we've taken, whether it was right or wrong. But what is needed to know? We really have to know, well, what's going on with these these kids at these certain age groups, physiologically, biologically, but also psychologically. I mean, that's a very important aspect. So if you've worked with different age groups, especially in the same context, same programs, and or maybe you've worked with some people that maybe have some different mental capacities or some abnormalities, then that really changes how we sort of organize some of the conditioning. How do we break that up? And so it's really important that you know the characteristics of your specific age group, and that could be their age, that could also be their gender, have a good understanding of their biological level, right? And that's where sort of that testing comes in. Why do we need to know that? One, we want to maximize our outcome. But two, right, remember the other context is we want to make sure that our programs are heavily involved in reducing their risk of injury, right? And historically, we've always said there's two reasons that we train: to improve performance and to reduce the risk of injury, right? And those are sort of the underpinning when we're developing some of these programs. I think using Olympic preparation is a really good is a really good example of sort of a pseudo long-term development. In other words, this Olympic ends, their potential Olympians for the next one. We come out and we map out a 4-year plan. I remember a specific presentation at the NSCA conference several years ago, and it was, the gold medal bobsled winner. So they looked at, and he gave a perfect example of, okay, they evaluated where they're good, where they're not good, and they came up with a 4-year plan. And what's interesting is you have to take acceptance for that. In other words, if you're going to be focusing and making changes in these different areas, understanding the impact of that, right? So during, for example, a periodization block where we're really hyper focused on development of force production, that power may be reduced, hypertrophy or power endurance is going to be reduced. So when we're doing our evaluation procedures, that we know that and we match them up appropriately. We also have seen it in specific sports like USA Baseball, USA Hockey, where they've created these development programs as sort of feeders into, and then eventually making their way up into the pros. Not necessarily just athletic. I mean, there is some emphasis specifically on some sport, but they've done a really good job at making it an environment for the children to be coached by really good coaches. So if we look at, typically the coaches at these youth levels, they're the volunteers. They're not necessarily people that have my background, and that, it could be someone that comes from a completely different industry and they just happen to have a child in the program and want to be able to help, but they don't really have an understanding exactly of all the characteristics that obviously we're discussing today. So within those programs, I actually also have some coaching education programs to really bring the parents up to that sort of coach level. And when we look at the multidisciplinary approach of long-term athletic development, I mean, those are two key players, when we're working and starting at that really really low age. The sports science and looking at, how we're able to better develop, and there's a new certification, just coming out by the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And so historically, we've also looked at performance coaches or strength coaches as sort of the earlier sports scientists, and being able to collect that data, interpret that data, and then implement that data, right? And so that's created this whole transition into, now not only do we actually have like sports scientists within a lot of these, especially higher level organizations, but there was a time too when we didn't even have, performance or strength coaches. So adaptations to resistance training. So that's obviously a young lady who was performing a snatch exercise. And some people will look at that at first glance and say, no, 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 no. We shouldn't be doing that. That is very, very dangerous. Well, let me put it back on you. What do you think? Is it dangerous? And if so, how are you justifying that? Pause, right? So remember that we're supposed to be evidence-based. And what does the evidence say with regards to resistance training? Well, resistance training specifically for conditioning, right? In other words, having a qualified person there and we're actually training them for athleticism, we find that the overall injury rates, and I had written this a long time ago, I think there's been some changes since then, but it gets the point across. And what we find is that there's a very, very low injury rate. And in fact, what we do see is, as a result of it, it may actually also improve one's interest in being part of a fitness program later on in life. And so that's actually a really, really good thing. And then potentially, as a result of conditioning, not only do we increase performance, we may have also decreased their risk of injury. So yeah, the answer is, can we do it? Or that's the question. The answer is absolutely. We do have some concerns that are often brought up. It's like, well, what about the growth plate, the epiphyseal growth plates in those long bones? Are they subjected to these high forces? They can be, but remember that if you're doing an appropriate athletic development program in the youth, the emphasis, especially when they're that young, is not overloading them like we might do with an Olympian, right? So it is age or biologically appropriate to perform these types of activities, especially when we're using the right volume load schemes. I use another example when people still argue and say, well, when we look at, those forces, they're really, really high. Well, they're really high anywhere. So these are actually my kids jumping off a rock when we were going hiking one time. And so a single jump, we can actually exert as much as 3.5 to 5 times body weight when they're landing. So the rate of force development is extremely high. The impact forces are extremely high. So if you've got kids playing on playgrounds and jumping and running around, the forces aren't actually any more dangerous than what we might see in a supervised conditioning program. In fact, they're usually much, much less, at least until they start getting trained. So adaptations to resistance. That's obviously not a real picture, but I show that a lot because even working right now with a lot of parents and a lot of young athletes and even coaches is remembering there's a very large disparity, when we look at the youth athlete. In other words, a 4-year-old is different than an 8-year-old. An 8-year-old is different than a 12-year-old. A 12-year-old is different than a 15-year-old. And then there are moments in time also where we see differences in gender, and that our expectations need to be appropriate. So there are two really good papers that I've emphasized here that do a really in-depth analysis in looking at a lot of this information. So firstly, we'll look at muscle size. So looking at the cross-sectional area, we know that cross-sectional area does have relationship to its ability to produce force. And so one would think that if we can improve cross-sectional area, therefore we should be able to improve in force. And we also know that from many studies with adults that we can improve cross-sectional area through hypertrophy style of training and various training modes that are designed to do so and do have a relationship to the improvements in strength output. The question is this something viable? Can we accomplish this in the youth population? Well, predominantly it's going to be after puberty, right? And again, let's think about that for a second. The earlier emphasis with regards to training really doesn't have to do with much of that anyway. And then also from a hormonal perspective, a lot of this is directly related to their hormonal function and their ability to actually increase in the various aspects regarding cross-sectional area, and they just don't have the capability of doing so. What's challenging is you take these young athletes, you train them, and they get stronger over the course of time. Now, let's say you had them for the 6 weeks I referred to earlier. And that happened to me a lot where, when we did some of these programs, we saw kids improve and they got stronger. Well, what are the reasonings behind that? Well, they're multifactorial, but let's say that we were measuring cross-sectional area and we didn't see an increase in cross-sectional area and they actually got stronger. Well, then there goes against the argument. What if we did see an increase in cross-sectional area? Are we actually responsible for that? Or is it part of growth and maturity? And the answer is a lot of this actually has to do with growth and maturity. So the literature it's pretty sparse. We don't have a lot of good data showing that, there's a great amount of information that we can actually accomplish that. But that's okay. Tendon size is another one. When we look at cross-sectional area and stiffness of the tendon, it's directly related also because it's our connection. And if it were to give way like an elastic band, right, then that wouldn't be very good. Our ability to transfer the energy from the muscle tissue into the levers would be, well, subpar. So we lose out on that. Well, what happens as a result of training is we can actually increase the cross-sectional area and the stiffness of the tendon and the musculotendinous junction. And again, we also see that as a result of normal growth and maturation in children. So do we actually have the ability to say that we can enhance that? And the answer is, well, it really depends. That maybe later on, again, post-puberty, there might be some opportunity to make some of those claims. But in general, we kind of account it towards the growth and natural maturity level. But I want to throw a question out here to you as well. Well, what if we took someone who is completely sedentary and we did see those dramatic changes? Again, is it because of the training, or what happens when they're sedentaries? We're seeing a lot with some of these youth populations when maybe they're only playing, one sport throughout the season, and that's fine. They're not doing anything else with regards to sport, but they may not be doing anything else with regards to fitness or physical activity, and so there may be an actual decline. So worst case is I'm not actually inducing these changes that we see in the adult population, but maybe I'm getting them back up to normal, or I'm at least reducing the regression that occurs as a result of being sedentary. Just throwing that out there for consideration. Fascicle length, right? So we look at the fascicles as these group of sarcomeres. So that has a direct relationship to our ability to produce force through velocity. And it does also have something to do with that musculotendinous unit, right? How it connects to and how it aids to the fact of increasing the tendinous cross-sectional area as well as stiffness and improving the overall ability to contract and produce very high velocities of contraction. In other words, being able to move the same weight or the same resistance faster. Yes, it has a relationship to rate of force development and power. What do we see? Again, some similarities with regards to mostly dealing with normal growth and maturation, but opportunities in post-puberty. As we see with these others, does that mean that we should halt? Well, the answer is no, because unless you know exactly, and we do not have a microscope into identifying exactly where their biological level is, but again, that's why we use that PHV and whether or not they've met their growth spurt, and we might have a better opportunity, and we may actually use that to influence our training, but it doesn't mean that we're going to completely halt. Maybe there are some other characteristics to take into consideration. So also related is the neural aspect. So here's what's interesting. Again, we see just normal growth and development does have an influence on these neural characteristics, right? So we can increase rate coding, we can increase motor unit recruitment, and all the characteristics associated with neural adaptation. So we have seen that there is some potential to maybe improve in that. Is it specifically related to the resistance training protocol? It might have something to do with it, but worst case scenario again is we're training them to capitalize on whatever potential level that they're capable of reaching at that specific level of maturity. And we've seen that a lot, and it's not unusual again. And one of the examples that I just used earlier was after 6 weeks of training, we saw an increase in force production with no increase in cross-sectional area. Well, what happened? Well, a lot of that is neural adaptations. And we see that in the adult population as well, to where it is enhanced. Again, was it the result of training and increasing cross-sectional area, some of these other characteristics? Well, neural adaptation is a funny thing in that just giving someone something new to perform, it has local as well as, more complex central effects with regards to, cortical organization and plasticity. Think about it almost as another event or another type of physical activity that might be really good for kids to be involved in. Really, really interesting. And I want to throw this one out there too. So this is looking at the self, things like self-efficacy, self-worth, and global self-worth. So one of the things that happens as a result of that, whether it's associated specifically with the biological outcomes or neurological outcomes as a result of resistance training, well, there's a sense of accomplishment, and despite what the reasoning behind it was related to obtaining more advanced movement capabilities just as a result of skill acquisition through resistance training. And I think I've got a video here in a moment here with a young gal, Abby, and to show not being able to perform a power clean to do, she did much better given the time frame, but that's a sense of accomplishment. And so the self-worth or self-efficacy is a huge component. One of the other byproducts that we typically saw in a lot of our programming is just because of the amount of level of physical activity that we got these kids involved in, they tended to lose body composition. Not an intent, but again, just really a byproduct. And it was so dramatic that in many of these kids, it dramatically changed their self-esteem and self-efficacy. For example, I had one athletic director just elated, to see some of the differences in some of the kids in their confidence in losing weight. I did have one example of where a coach was a little bit disappointed because he says, man, I like having all that extra mass on that player, but he had higher rate of force development, he had higher output, and he ran faster. So their conception or misconception of just being a block or just being a massive weight, in there as an advantage. And there is a relationship between the two. But that has a dramatic influence even on some of these young kids and their ability, to play some of those sports that they might not otherwise be interested in playing. And in fact, we had a lot of kids come into the programs that we ran that were not involved in a specific organized sport, but they came because they wanted to build that self-confidence and actually get involved in a sport that maybe they weren't involved in before. So it gave them the confidence to go into some of these highlights. So the stretch shortening cycle, I bring this one up specifically because this is a really huge component in sport, right? So this is your ability to transition from, a loading contraction into a positive contraction, or against force or against gravity, for example. And so the stretch shortening cycle is an adaptation that we do train heavily, and we think of that as in more like plyometric types of activities. But the characteristics of improving in the stretch shortening cycle, we see that the co-contraction effects of children is much greater than what we see in the adults, for example. In other words, when there's a co-contraction with a closed chain activity, even open chain activities, we see the synergistic effect between opposing muscle groups. It's to create stabilization, but also to create sort of the safety mechanism to make sure that they can't overdo whatever type of activity. So we know in the adult population, one of the things that changes as a result of reducing that antagonistic muscle group and reducing the resistance against a particular movement pattern. Well, we also see that as a result of growth and development and maturation in the young population. Is it happening as a result of training? There's some indication it might actually be happening. Is it because of our training, or is it just because we're implementing that, or that's a specific activity, or would they get the exact same thing if they just went out and played on the playground for the same amount of time that we were going to be training them? Does it matter? And the reason, I'll say it doesn't matter, we live in a rural area. It's very safe. We actually have a lot of opportunity to have very safe playgrounds, but that's not something that's available in all parts of the world, all parts of the country. The other aspect that we see is the Golgi tendon. We have a higher density of Golgi tendon in the youth population, and either facilitation, a reduction in that activity. So remember that the Golgi tendon organ, it suppresses activity, so it's inhibitory to muscle contraction of that particular structure. Right, so the Golgi tendon organ in my biceps, if I'm trying to produce a really high biceps force and it's a protective mechanism, actually causes it to reduce, right? And so we see a compensatory change as a result of growth, but again, something that is consistently seen in the adult population, and we may have something to do in what's going on here. The pre-activation and reflex control, I'll just kind of combine those two things together, is it's reduced in comparison to adults, even untrained adults in the child. But what we may find is as a result of being involved in training, and again, is it in place of maybe just playing another sport or running and jumping? Well, if they're not doing that, then whatever the reason is, we do see some changes and potential opportunity to capitalize on those and enhancing, some reflex control, preparing for landing and then turning that around and taking off as rapidly as possible. We used to do a rapid single leg counter movement jump, and we could look at changes in ground reaction forces even within 6 weeks, because we implemented a lot of plyometric activity because we can capitalize. Neurological changes tend to take place, much more rapidly than things like cross-sectional area, which might have something to do with long-term athletic development and the various training modes you might be implementing. So, question. Abby, who is a new athlete to performance conditioning as an 8th grade soccer player, improved her vertical jump, her counter movement vertical jump, by 3 inches in 6 weeks. So Abby did not do any performance conditioning before, and yes, you can criticize me for this, but hey, after 3 weeks of training, she couldn't do any sort of movement patterns such as that, and we continue to work on getting those elbows up and down into that squat position, but starting with a broomstick, going to power cleaning a 20 kilogram bar when, by the way, she only weighed 30 kilograms. That was pretty good. So how would you explain her improvements? What do you think actually accomplished what we saw as a result of these improvements? Is it my awesomeness with regards to coaching? I like to always think so, but maybe that's not always the case. Naturally occurring adaptations to movement, enhanced technique, confidence. Well, she was pretty scared of that bar at first. I mean, let's face it, she's this tiny little thing that's about 4 foot 11 inches, and here she is, moving an Olympic weightlifting bar, which was pretty awesome. So we think it's a combination of all of those things. So yes, when we look at the outcomes perspective of a developmental program, it's all of these. And I know we break these down characteristically by the various components, but I always like to bring people back in and remember exactly, sort of what's going on as well as our ultimate goals here. Aerobic conditioning. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, and ironically, there's probably less on the results of aerobic conditioning than there is on resistance training. So can we really say? Well, as you might have guessed, in normal growth and development or maturation, we do see changes as a result of aerobic capacity, for example, right? Earlier studies, the few that are out there, they did kind of focus on sort of that constant intensity training, like running cross country or something like that. And I think, any track and field coach arguably would say, yeah, I know for a fact that, the conditioning actually improved their running time. Well, what was it? Was it a change in technique? Are we capitalizing on their growth and development of their limb length and enhancing their neurological patterns? Or, what did we actually get to? Even when we look at atrioventricular oxygen concentration differences in trained versus untrained, they tend to be very, very similar. So one thing that we've seen as some changes is using this high intensity interval training to induce these sort of cardiovascular training opportunities. Well, like training a soccer player, right? So using fartlek style training to where we're manipulating this, and well, we actually do. We see some similar changes as we see in the constant intensities and velocities. Well, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there's some unique opportunity there, and that tends to take less time when we're doing these high intensity interval training modes. And remember that it also changes up and gives us some different characteristics as to what may actually be happening. I mean, earlier thoughts were that, okay, we did improve stroke volume, and that kind of makes sense as a result of an increase in overall demand, especially for blood volume, and especially if we really use this high intensity. But now we see that it could be, in the early phase and in the late phase 1 and phase 3, or transitioning from phase 2 into phase 3 with regards to oxidative phosphorylation, where we transitioned more quickly from sort of that anaerobic into that aerobic event and enhanced oxidative phosphorylation. That may have something to do with making changes to enhancing their aerobic profile. But most of the studies are pretty consistent, and it seems to be somewhere between 5 and 10%. So there's not a dramatic change, but let's face it, 5 or 10% improvement in aerobic capacity is going to be worth something, especially now if we're also making changes and capitalizing on what was going on from additional growth and maturation. Or imagine adding like a stretch shortening cycle type of activity, within that, and what that might also do to enhance overall performance. Well, we can look at the nitty gritty, and then we can actually look at the outcomes component to it. What is the actual dose response? Again, another very popular paper looking at an in-depth meta-analysis as to all the information or the majority of the literature that's out there regarding conditioning for the youth population. So this is predominantly looking at strength components. There is a vertical jump aspect in a lot of these papers, and sort of considered as one of the other characteristics that could be really, really good. Across the board, we see combinations of free weights and machines and a combination of both of those, and then even some other types of activities such as jumping activities or sprinting activities. So very, very challenging to take this conglomerate and file it all the way down. Also looking at the breakdown of the relative Tanner stages, or the level of maturity and development. So it's becoming much more popular today is breaking them down into peak height velocity, or where they fall within their overall growth and development. So as far as frequency goes, now we seem to be, well, maybe 3 times a week, but the literature is all over the place. 1, 2, and 3 provide us some very, very similar results. And it kind of goes back to, maybe it's just as a result of maturation. But this is real challenging, because to then look at some of these other components and did everyone perform it for the appropriate period? Did everyone perform it for the appropriate intensity? So when we tease that out, we do find that greater than 23 weeks has been shown to be efficacious with regards to a resistance training program and changing those metrics that we consider to be performance profiles. Intensity, also 80 to 89% of 1 repetition maximum. Again, something that we tended not to see in those younger populations. We also see volume and sets, 1 and 3, not much different, somewhere between 3 and 5. We do see, especially for vertical jump, that the optimal was around 3 sets, and then 4 for mostly some of the sports performance type of metrics. Also in the repetition range, 6 to 8 consistently for typical average performance. But what was interesting is for plyometric and some of the sport performance, like the sprinting characteristics or metrics, we find that the 3 to 5 and the 9 to 12 give us some similar outcomes, which is kind of interesting. But again, did they get the same rest periods, that we're seeing here, sort of that maximal 3 to 4 minutes, and whether or not, that was appropriate with regards to whether they're doing this higher or lower volume. Well, if we look at, if we're not inducing too much stress, if we look at we're not inducing too much fatigue, sometimes having the ability to perform more and getting more caloric expenditure, getting more involvement in the physical activity aspect of things, can also be a pretty good thing. So most of these are dealing with sort of the strength aspect of things, like 1 repetition maximums in squats and bench press, but also vertical jump. So we are missing out on some of these other things, like there's not as much, for example, in a power clean. So if that's something of interest that we see as one of the metrics, like a mid-thigh pull, isometric mid-thigh pull, not really that common, because you need some specialized equipment to be able to accomplish some of that. So there's a definite need for more literature, but at least what we have seen is, we're certainly not wasting our time. And again, based on all the other metrics and characteristics involved in a training program, there's a lot of benefit to making sure that we introduce these into the athletic development programming. Okay, injury characteristics. So when we're looking at developing the program, some things that we take into consideration are, what do the injuries look like? And again, can we use some of these interventions as not only sport performance, but also potential reduction in injury? So for example, we did a project and we looked at the difference in landing in the power clean, and its influence on absorbing the ground reaction forces, peak ground reaction forces, in the landing characteristics from the power clean. And yes, it actually does make a difference. So when we look at the benefit of, think about an indoor sprinter, and they run really, really fast, or a sprinter in general, they run really, really fast, but they can just coast. They don't have to slow down, stop really rapidly, and then change direction. Although I do recall at Tufts University. It was a small indoor facility, and they had padded walls, and I'm sure that happens a lot. So sprinters actually do need to slow down um, on occasion. And so there are some implications when we're looking at injury characteristics and uh, and why this actually makes a difference. We want to make sure that we look at the characteristics of certain sports. So, for example, ACL injuries, where do they tend to happen more so? Um, genders, age differences, and things like that. Okay, so other injury characteristics are things that are pretty common, either to a specific age range or a sport. That's why it's good to look at the physiological profile or requirements to play and be involved in a specific sport at a specific level. And we should be doing two things, making sure that we really address some of the mechanisms that are associated with an increased risk, and focusing on that level of performance. So I harp on ACL injuries, for example, and you look at these specific metrics, and the majority of them happen at the high school age level, and so especially in females. So it makes sense that we really need to take a little bit of extra effort in reducing this and figuring out, first off, well, what is the problem, and making sure that we have a program that addresses it appropriately. So monitoring and programming, and I don't really get into a whole lot of programming. That's another course. But so testing and evaluating, it's something that's necessary. It's the only way that you know that whatever it is that you're doing is actually working. I know, we like to take credit for winning a season and things like that, but there's so many different variables, to even think about making that happening. So, few things. A baseline. Great opportunity to show where we are and where we're going to be. Whether or not we implemented something that was effective, but also, let's say they get injured, so we know that we can get them back at least to where they were before, by having that baseline, and certainly measuring that throughout the time range. Also, some of these tests give us some injury risk characteristics, so predictability to some of these patterns, such as landing characteristics in dynamic knee valgus, for example, that we can capture from a performance test like a single leg vertical jump. But in general, giving us an opportunity to figure out where the deficits are in performance. Where can we make some of these changes to get them better, right? Relative to what it is that we're measuring and what we know to be important from an athletic standpoint. So that's related. I call it intra and inter. So that's, within them, making sure that we're competing against themselves. They have a vertical jump of 18 inches now. We want to get them to 22 inches, by the end of the 3-year program, for example. Or if, there's a specific characteristic when they're at that level of what's required to make it in that particular sport, and to know that that's a benchmark. It's something for us to reach for. So those are many different reasons for doing this, but in general, making sure that whatever it is that we're doing is going to be appropriate. So you need to make sure that you choose the appropriate battery of tests. Some of them may not be validated for a specific age group or a specific sport, or even matter for them. So it's important that we have the appropriate test methodology. So I do a lower extremity screening program for, women sports such as soccer or volleyball, which is going to be different than what we might be doing in baseball or softball. Also, we need to be able to interpret and implement. So the first level is going to be interpret. First off, we have so much data that's available to us. What's most useful, and how can we look at that and utilize that information? And again, I think the literature supports us in that notion as to, what direction to go to. But it's a challenge because, there's a lot of people out there making stuff and coming up with a whole bunch of data that may or may not actually make that much of a difference. The implementation piece is being able to take that interpretation and, well, what do I do with it? How do I change a program, based on that? So this is a screenshot of one of my assessment tools is looking at a counter movement jump. It's a double leg, but I do get single leg characteristics such as flight time and takeoff velocity and things like that, which to some people, they may see this and they may not really know exactly what to do with it. We got to learn. So if it is important, it takes a little bit of time to make sure that we have a relative understanding of what we have at our fingertips and how do we actually implement that. Well, a lot of times in the monitoring process, we're going to use that to sort of feed into, along with the baseline testing that we took at from the performance perspective, what it is that we're going to be doing, not just the types of exercises, but really that volume loading scheme. Monitoring and programming, right? So you can look over here on the right. So this is the evolution of the performance-based outcome measure, right? So relative indicators as to what I might want to see. And you can see there's an overreaching and, we dramatically made changes here as we got into, say, the preseason. So that's looking at what's referred to as the evolution of performance. And because it's using technology, I can go back and I can match that up and we can run some different views of this. And then there's load monitoring. So we can look at the characteristics of their specific, sport or play at whatever season it is that they're in, and then how we can actually match that up with the loading characteristics with regards to our programming. Okay, that's as a result of technology. It's just made everything a whole lot easier. We didn't always have that, so we had to like write stuff down and use basic spreadsheets, but it was based on literature that someone else, evaluated in sport, such as, the amount of time spent in distances that they ran or the relative intensities and all the movement characteristics. And then to what we know today with these dashboards that we can set sort of the base level relative to the type of athlete, the gender, the age, and whatever other profile characteristics that we might actually be looking at. So you could see here, so this is a dashboard looking at these 6 tests. So there's the benchmark, which is the dark blue here, right? And then we can see where they were measured in September of 18. Yeah, I stole this from another presentation, so this isn't mine. And so it tells us, where we're at relative to where we want to be. And then in a follow-up test, we can see that in the gray here, some areas we met our benchmark and then even exceeded them. Others we still have some work to do. But real quick and easy, because a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it really takes this information and filters it down to a level at which we can turn this around really, really fast. So here's an actual example. So this was published in Sports Science, and so this group from ETSU, so they were using relatively low tech. They were using jump height, sprint time, and RPE, which is a relatively subjective evaluation of someone's perceived exertion, right? The perceived exertion. Also, they gave us the SRP, the session rate of perceived exertion. What that is that's taking your RPE that the athlete thinks that they're at based on the Borg scale, and it's multiplied by the number of minutes of play. So it's actually validated, and well, it is very inexpensive to be able to use that type of information. So that's just looking at their overall exertion. It's not giving us, force characteristics, the amount of time they change direction, and things like that. But in any event, so here's an example where, they looked at pre a vertical jump and sprint on this particular slide, and they measured them within 30 minutes after the end of a specific match. So they were looking at that based on, well, because they're really busy, and what kind of impact does that have? And you can see basically a constant decline throughout that. We see an incline linearly in their sprint time, which means that they got slower. And so that tells us that, there was a decrease in performance relative to where they should be. So they were actually tested at the end of a training session, so kind of matched up with as though they were in play, but to show that there was actually a decrease in performance, but it continued. And this is pretty common. The literature is pretty common in showing that even after one event, we do tend to see a decrease, but it tends to level off if we're doing our due diligence and we've got the appropriate player load time. So this is just graphical representation looking at the SRPE, which is relative to the amount of time. And as you can see from match 1 to match 3, that there was an actual decrease in SRPE. So you would think that hopefully that would match up, but statistically speaking, they didn't see any relationship between the counter movement jump and the sprint time. So real simple and easy to see and show that, and maybe you're able to match this up with wins and losses and some other characteristics that we see in sport management. But in any event, to be able to show, that there is a constant decline, at least within this portion of their season. So who should be involved in youth long-term athletic development? Well, remember, these are relatively young, so, well, we can't get away. The athletes, the players must have buy-in. They need to be able to do all of this and be part of the program and accept whatever it is that's being presented to them. Not always the case, especially as they get a little bit older. The sport coaches, because it's a coordinated effort, especially when you got kids that are playing, multiple sports, which is something that we hope for. Should the strength performance coach? Well, I think we'd all agree that they should be. The medical team. Yeah, they definitely do need to be part of this. I think historically we've always seen, at least in my experience, that the athletic trainers were also part of the preseason testing from the basic medical aspect, but also some of these potential risk profiles. Parents, again, another group that could be a little bit challenging to work with, but making sure that they're educated and explained, hey, maybe it's not the most beneficial thing to have your kid, continuously play the same sport 12 months out of the year and get specialists in, all the different aspects of that sport versus, going out and doing some other things. Administrators, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned earlier, this was really important in when I was working at those levels. I mean, they're the ones that let me play and run these programs at the school systems, but also, the coaches within the programs. It was interesting. I always had, for a while there, had one that would come out and he would want to do his own program because, he was the coach and thought his was going to be better than mine. That's up to them, but so it was always a challenge. There was always something that was challenging. So yes, it is all of the above. Everyone's important at getting this to run as smoothly as possible. So, yep, that's my daughter. So this was this is what I was referring to earlier, a presentation I was doing on motor development in youth. So we started our kids very young. No, not really. It's just, like I said before, it was based on modeling and we try and get our children involved in various things. And that's the difference between being athletic versus a sports specialist is, For example, when we look at what my son has done, he's played multiple sports over the last year. He just loves playing very different things anyway. My daughter, very, very athletic, but just doesn't have interest in some of the sports that she's played, and that's okay. At some point, she will be, probably specializing when she gets to that level. But it's really important that she remains being very active in all these different things. So we know that it's a multidisciplinary approach. It takes a lot of people involved for these programs to actually be successful. And within that, and that's what's important, when I work with parents to convince them that, nope, you don't need to spend 24/7, on a specific sport 12 months out of the year, and that actually it's more beneficial to do some of these other different things. And then, of course, monitoring. It's good for business anyway, so for me to be able to show the parents or the coaches and the administrators that whatever it is I'm doing is successful based on my KPIs, my key performance indicators, right? And that it's not my fault if maybe they don't perform as well on the field, right? Because again, our focus is on the athleticism and not specific sports. But anyway, I hope this was useful. Like I said, high level overview, and there's a lot more detail that we can go in. But let me know if you have any questions.